welcome to the first edition of Translating Strategy into Performance Management on Amalgate Radio Communications this beautiful Monday, August 4th, 2025. So it's the fourth edition and it's also the 4th of August 2025. Have you been? Hope you're enjoying the beautiful month of August. This is our first episode in this month, so we can say Happy New Month. Welcome again, and it's going to be a very delightful ride. Thank you very much for joining us on Amalgate Radio Communications. My name remains Tolu Omodara, and this is Amalgate Radio Communications and the fourth edition of Translating Strategy into Performance. Hope you've had a wonderful month of August thus far, and we're going to begin, as we always do, with a quick recap of the highlights of last week's episode. Again, to the fourth edition of Translate here on Amalgate Radio Communications, and I remain your host, Tolu Omodara. So last week we talked about connecting cycle to cycle, right? We took another how of translating strategy into performance management. If you remember, we had taken a how, well, we looked at the why. Why do we need to connect strategy with performance management? 2 weeks ago, and the last week, or 3 weeks ago, beg your pardon, then 2 weeks ago, we looked at how do we connect strategy to performance management, and last week we looked at another how of connecting strategy to performance management, or translating strategy into performance management, and specifically we looked at connecting cycle to cycle, right? Cycle to cycle. In other words, strategic management process has a cycle, and we shared the Amalgate timer strategic management process, right? The Amalgate timer strategic management cycle, and then we also shared the Amalgate PIMA performance management cycle, right? And we said one way to translate strategy into performance management is to connect the PIMA strategic management cycle with the PIMA performance management cycle. The PIMA, of course, standing for planning, P, implementation, I, monitoring, M, evaluation, E, and revision, R. I repeat, planning, P, implementation, I, monitoring, M, evaluation, E, and revision, R. So that is the Amalgate strategic management PIMA cycle that we shared. Then we shared the PIMA, Amalgate PIMA performance management cycle, where the P also stands for planning, but which includes contracting. Unlike the case of strategic management, this specifically includes contracting. So you're doing your performance planning, you also do your performance contracting, right? Contracting is a sub part of the performance planning process. Then you have your E, which is execution. There should be performance execution of the contracted performance goals. Then, of course, there must be monitoring. The M remains the same, and then there should be the A, which is performance assessment, right? The M of the performance monitoring should include coaching. It's not just a punitive process. We said it should also be an opportunity for coaching, and there should be assessment, right? Performance assessment, which should then be followed with rewards, and the rewards can also be consequences depending on the quality of performance, right? So we said that within this framework are opportunities for connection, very, very, very important, right? And if you can connect the planning of your strategic management process to the planning of your performance management process, as you should, what happens is that you'll be translating the organizational strategic goals into the performance goals at the divisional, departmental unit, and of course individual levels, right? Very, very important. And then, of course, as much as possible, the P itself should be evidence-based planning, very, very important, right? And we said what does not get measured does not get done, but so also does what does not get monitored not get done. It's not just what does not get measured that does not get done, but what does not get monitored also does not get done. Please take note of the M. We're coming back to that. The M stands for monitoring in the PIMA cycle, and the M also starts with monitoring in the PIMA cycle, right? So whether you are monitoring at level of strategic goals for the organization, or you're monitoring at level of performance plans for the individual or the unit or the department, department, as the case may be, whatever level of the organization you're monitoring at, it's important to note that performance is a critical enabler of implementation. Very, very important. We said it's important for them to be monitoring. I remember saying that I really do not see how they can be focused and as well as strategic and aligned execution if there is no consistent monitoring. I repeat, I don't see how they can be focused as well as strategic and aligned execution if there is no consistent monitoring. So implementation is something that you do on a consistent and regular basis, and of course it must be supported, enabled, facilitated by monitoring, right? The monitoring enables implementation. Very, very, very important. Monitoring is also, very intrinsic to effective continuous execution. Extremely critical, right? And this is one thing we emphasize. We said this is why managerial responsibility continues in that phase, in that phase where the managers also use performance monitoring to coach, like I said, not just to monitor, to ensure that goals are progressing as necessary, but also to coach. However, the monitoring, of course, has to precede even the coaching, because for you to know the areas where your subordinates or your direct reports will be having challenges, you have to be monitoring. You have to monitoring them against the goals that should have been set, the performance goals that should have been set. And this monitoring, one thing we said is that it's important for it not just to be ongoing, right? It's also important for the measures, the monitoring measures, to have been defined in both quantitative and qualitative terms. The quantitative usually would be numerical, and they will speak about the what is being done. But the qualitative measures, which speaks more to the why, would often provide more insight into why there is a degree of performance or there is the lack thereof. So it's really important that measures have been pre-defined, and that's what happens at the performance planning stage, right? Just like it happens at the strategic planning stage, goals should have been set in both quantitative and qualitative terms. And similarly, at the performance planning stage, where you have translating strategic plans into performance plans at the lower levels of the organization, it's important that the measures by which the effectiveness of attainment or achievement of these goals would be evaluated. It's important that the measures have been clearly, explicitly defined in both quantitative and qualitative terms, right? Of course, finally, the R, like we said, stands for revision. Why are you going to evaluate after you do your monitoring, which is more ongoing? That the evaluation tends to be periodic. So why would you do your periodic evaluation if you are not going to make any changes? I'm talking about the necessary changes. So if you are still going to do the same thing that is not working, then exactly why do you do the evaluation, right? So your evaluation should give way to the revision, right? And that revision, we should, of course, reconnect you back to the planning, because as you get ready to make some revisions to your current strategy, to your current strategic planning process based on feedback from the evaluation, that again feeds into the new process, right? That's the new planning process, right? Now, when you begin to translate your strategic goals, the strategic goals of the organization, into the performance objectives of the different roles, you are now connecting strategy with performance management. I repeat, when you begin to translate the strategic goals, right, of the organization into the performance objectives of the different roles, you are now connecting strategy with performance management. You are now translating strategy into performance management to ensure that you are connecting the strategic management cycle to the performance management cycle using technology as much as possible. Well, this is how far we would be able to go in terms of taking a recap from last week's edition of the program. Remember, these programs, these episodes are all uploaded on our Amogate Radio Communications YouTube page. We have over 280 programs, 280 broadcasts, broad ranging from sports to geopolitics to leadership to economics to strategy, like very broad range of resources that you can benefit from. Please subscribe to our YouTube page and encourage those you know to do so too, right? Amogate Radio Communications is a very rich reservoir of knowledge, very rich bank of deep and broad knowledge that comes from nearly 2 decades of doing what we do excellently well. by God's grace. So that's a quick recap of last week. We can't go into all of the depths, but you can always catch up with last week's episode at Amode Radio Communications YouTube page. Now we're going to go into today's the first of today's program. Now the first of today's program is going to center around monitoring. Remember I said take note of that end because we are coming back to it. We are looking at monitoring the effectiveness and efficiency of products and services using performance management for strategic accountability. I repeat, monitoring the effectiveness and efficiency of products and services using performance management for strategic accountability. Right? In other words, we'll be discussing the monitoring imperative, and we're going to talk about different types of measures to emphasize. Now, let me say this very clearly. When you're translating strategy into performance management, like I said, you do it across the entire cycle, right? Planning is one cycle. Your strategic goals at the level of the organization should definitely be translated into performance objectives at different levels of the organization and in the performance management process, right? Again, when you're implementing the strategic goals for the organization, these should correlate with the performance objectives that are being implemented or executed at different levels of the organization. Let's come to the monitoring, right? That's the end, the midpoint. When you're monitoring the implementation of the strategic goals of the organization, in as much as the goal is equal to the sum of the parts at the minimum, sometimes the goal is greater than the sum of the parts, but at the minimum, the whole should be equal to the sum of the parts. So when you're monitoring, right, when you're monitoring the implementation of the strategic objectives of the organization, it should be, equivalent to different managers at different levels monitoring the execution of the performance objectives of the different levels of the organization, because these performance objectives, right, of the different roles in the organization, like we said last week, and we have also quickly summarized this week, this different performance objective should culminate into the strategic goals of the organization. So monitoring the performance of the different roles in the organization should be tantamount to monitoring the implementation of the strategic objectives or strategic goals. I repeat, monitoring the implementation, monitoring the execution of the performance objectives of the different roles of the organization should be equivalent to, should culminate into monitoring the implementation of the strategic goals of the organization, especially if you have gone through the PI part of the performance, PI part of the strategic management cycle, and you have ensured that you have effectively connected it to the PE part of the performance management cycle. In other words, the strategic planning phase of the strategic management cycle has been well connected to the performance planning phase of the performance management cycle, and the implementation, right, of the primer cycle is also well connected to the execution of the primer cycle. If that has happened, you have connected strategic plans to performance plans, and have also connected strategic implementation to performance execution at the top and the lower levels of the organization. Then, when you begin to monitor the performance objectives, the execution of the performance objectives of the different levels of the organization, it should be equal to, equivalent to culminating into monitoring the performance or the strategic objectives, the strategic goals of the organization. Now, let me quickly say something very quickly here. I hinted at it last week, and I've also touched on it very quickly. But now let me go a little bit more broadly into it. Let's talk about the measures, right? The types of measures to emphasize. Now, there's something we've said before. Remember, I said there was a program last year, a year ago, Roadmap to Organizational Strategy. I did the program. It's on our Amode Radio Communications YouTube page. I think we did a whole quarter on it, so you have rich resources on that. And I'm not going to go deeply into what we have already covered, right? We are focusing more on making the connection between strategy and performance management. But let me allude to something which is the principle of strategy, right? When we talk about strategy, we are talking about discrimination. To be strategic is to be discriminatory. That's the truth. If I say I'm strategic, It means that I am prioritizing certain things, right? We talk about the principle of strategic prioritization. I think I alluded to it last week too. You must identify your strategic priorities even in the planning process. You cannot give equal attention to everything as an organization. Same thing at the level of the department. As a matter of fact, even in terms of your contributions to the strategic organizations as the department, the things you are going to prioritize as the finance department may be different from what, for instance, the communication department will prioritize, because again, you have to be strategic in terms of what can deliver the maximum output or outcomes of impact. Last week, I remember referring to the Pareto principle, because that's the 80-20 rule, which states that 20% of your efforts will usually deliver 80%, typically or averagely or broadly speaking, deliver 80% of your outcomes, right? So as an organization, you want to say to yourself, in this given period, in this strategic period, what is the 20% I need to focus on? Ditto as a department, as a division, as a unit, and so on and so forth. Now, let's come to the measures. If you take that in mind, and if you go into your strategic planning process with that, and also go into your performance planning process at the lower levels of the organization with that in mind, you want to be discriminatory, right? To be strategic is to be discriminatory. We're going to be discriminating against 80% of measures in order to identify the 20% of measures that are very critical to delivering your goals. I repeat, you are going to be discriminatory against to 80% of measures that would necessarily not give you the Pareto effect, right? That will not give you the maximum impact. You'll be discriminatory against those measures, and you'll be trying to identify the 20% of measures that will deliver the 80% of results. That is the principle of strategic planning, which involves, anytime you hear the word strategic, it definitely involves a level of discrimination. Anytime you are practicing strategic prioritization, like we always advocate for, where you're identifying things to prioritize, you are simultaneously discriminating against certain things that do not qualify as priorities. Get that clear, right? So the process of being strategic is going through the data, going through the analysis, going through the forecasting, going through the environmental scanning, going through the internal assessment, and doing all of that data gathering and analysis to be able to determine where you should focus the most of your resources, including time, attention, money, people, in order to ensure that you are targeting resources at those measures, as those areas, at those activities, at those engagements that will deliver the maximum outcomes. Now, once you have done that, then it also follows that the measures that you're going to use as the basis for monitoring, the measures are also going to be directed at those key performance areas, right? Some call it key performance areas depending on the level of organization. Some will call it key performance indicators depending on the level of the structure, right? But you're going to be directing the bulk of your efforts to those key performance outputs, those key performance outcomes, those key performance areas, and they are likely to deliver the maximum impact and outcomes and output and so on. So those measures are what you want to focus on in monitoring, right? Those key performance measures are the ones you want to focus on in monitoring. Again, this is because there is the reality of limited resources, right? Including time, including money, including people, including attention. There's also the attention quotient, and because of that reality, you want to ensure that you are being targeted in your focus. You are being targeted with the use of resources for monitoring, because monitoring is an activity that takes time, it takes energy, it takes resources, and you want to make sure that every time you are having that monitoring. Last week, I remember saying that depending on the level of organization that you are working at, you may not be able to have this performance monitoring for more than once a quarter, right? If you are the CEO and you have so many responsibilities, you may not be able to speak to your direct reports more than once a quarter. If you're the head of a division or head of a region and you have a lot of people reporting to you, you may not be, and even if you have few people reporting to you, but the weight of your responsibility is significantly high, you may not be able to have the performance monitoring more than once a quarter. At the lower levels of the organization, you want to try to have it at least once a month. But if you're having it for just once a quarter, you want to make sure that you are focusing the performance monitoring time and attention on the most strategic measures, right? And that's why those measures must have been predefined in a manner that is extremely strategic. This is still Tolo Model on Amage Radio Communications. Thank you for being with us today, Monday, August 4th, 2025, for the 4th edition of Translating Strategy into Performance Management. We are looking at monitoring the effectiveness and efficiency of products and services, monitoring effectiveness and efficiency of products and services using performance management for strategic accountability. And we are also zooming in on the types of measures to emphasize to achieve this strategic accountability. We'll take a short break and we'll be right back. Thank you for being with us.
Harrogate, founded in 2008 out of a desire to build transgenerational structures for organizations, institutions, and nations. We have worked with large businesses, international development organizations, and public sector ministries and agencies. Harrogate, our uniqueness is that we do not just work for you, we work with you. For example, we do not leave you to the task after sourcing talent that will help the new hire settle into robust leadership development programs. We are technical experts in advising and supporting institutions on strategy and leadership, artificial intelligence, strategic human resource management, public sector reform, finance, audit and tax, FAT, and strategic communications. We do all this and more out of a desire to transform nations through institutions and organizations. For further inquiries, email contact@thearmygate.org or call +234 810 999 6666 +234 807 957 4151 and +161 0504 6026 www.thearmygate.org. Armygate, building to endure and transforming nations through institutions and organizations.
Welcome back. Thank you very much for being with us. We're having a wonderful time and we hope that you are too, right? So as I was saying, when you're looking at the measures to emphasize, you want to ask yourself, what are the key strategic priorities of the organization? It's very important to make that connection, because the reason why you're monitoring is to ensure that the promises, right, the promises that the organization has made to your clients, to your stakeholders, right, and by which they are going to measure the effectiveness and efficiency of your products and services are connected to the performance measures that you will be monitoring. Extremely important. This is how you use performance management for strategic accountability, right? They are going to hold you accountable, your stakeholders, your clients, your board, your shareholders. They are going to hold you accountable to certain promises. And like we always say, amalgate as much as possible. You want to keep them lean. Some will say lean and mean. We would like to say we want to keep them defined and streamlined in terms of strategic priorities, right? You want to identify your priorities. We usually don't believe in having more than 3 per strategic period, right? That helps you be very focused. And when you're also, cascading them down from or translating these strategic priorities into the performance management process, right, for execution, you also want to make sure that you maintain that same strategic prioritization. So your different levels of organizational structure are also not scattered in different directions. They know exactly what their priorities are at every level of the organizational structure, at the level of head of a division, head of a department, head of a unit, at an individual level. I need to know what my 3 priorities are. We usually don't want more than 3, maximum of 4, right? Maximum. Otherwise, as far as we're concerned, they are no longer strategic and they are no longer priorities. If you cannot streamline them to the top 3 as much as possible, then you are not having strategic priorities. You have not taken the time to do the thorough planning that helps you to arrive at the key priorities you want to focus on per period. Now, if you have done this, remember, like we we said, the moment you know what you're accountable for, beg your pardon, what you as an organization are accountable for to your critical stakeholders, your shareholders, your board, your clients, once you know what you're going to be answering to them about, then it becomes easy to focus on those in terms of implementation. It becomes easier also to translate this into performance goals for the different levels of the organization, for the different roles, for the different segments, for the different departments, and the measures that they would be focusing on, and that you as the manager of such roles will be monitoring for, must be tied to those that the organization would be measured by, that the organization will have strategic accountability for. Let me break this down just to give an example, and then we begin to round off. Let's say, for instance, that you want to have about 4 key measures, right? 4 key measures as an organization, and you want to look at one, your efficiency. Efficiency there usually refers to doing more with less. Generally speaking, effectiveness is about getting things done. Efficiency is the cost by which you are getting those things done. So let's say you want to measure one of the performance measures is your effectiveness. Another of your performance measures will be your efficiency, and then you can choose to also look at a third performance measure, and you can say you want to look at your for instance, your your service quality, right? Your service quality. Let's say those are some of the things you want to look at. Those are things you are accountable for. Those are things you have promised your stakeholders that you are going to watch out for, and they can hold you accountable to as a manager. Let's start with effectiveness. So effectiveness, like I said, is about getting things done. So right now, let's say you are trying to produce driverless cars, artificial intelligence cars, right? Your different competitors are already doing it, and you are yet to do it, and you want to catch up with that space. And you say, okay, we have been piloting because we don't want to copy, we don't want to, we want to produce something that is unique. So what we want to get done for this performance period is to also, release our own artificially controlled vehicle into the market. Let's say that's what you want to get done, and that's a singular priority that you are committing to for a performance period, right? And then let's come to efficiency. You also want to make sure that you are using sustainable resources to and let's say in terms of the effectiveness, you can set a time measure, and I'm still coming back to the measures as much as possible must be both quantitative and qualitative, and there are different ways. So but I'll come back to that. Let me go to the efficiency. So you want to use sustainable resources to achieve this goal. So effectiveness is releasing your own artificially intelligent vehicle into the market. That's getting things done, but you can get it done at a very high cost, and that will not be efficient. So you also set your efficiency goal to say this goal of releasing our own artificially intelligent car must be, or vehicle must be achieved or must be attained efficiently. That's your efficiency goal. And when you come to it, it's a service quality, and you say that we must provide this vehicle, this artificial intelligent vehicle into the market as an efficient resources, but also with high level quality of service. So those are the 3 measures, right? Because you have defined these as the measures, you now come to break it down. Now that is the strategic priority of the organization, right? So those measures are definitely tied, for instance, to things like effectiveness. Like I said, that would be a measure. Now the effectiveness could be one, getting the car released by this time of the year, right? So that, let's say it's a goal for your year 2025 to year 2026, and that year probably begins August. Maybe your organizational year begins in August, so it's August to July, and your goal could be, look, this must be done by July next year. You don't want it done at the end of the year, you want it done by July 2026. So you want to define that effectiveness, right? And you also, now it's just about getting it done. That's one measure. we want to get this done, and we want to get this done. That's not efficiency. You're not talking about the cost of getting this done. You're just saying this must be done. How do you connect this to performance goals of different parts of the organization, right? Because different parts of the organization have their roles to play. Of course, you probably have your engineering team. The engineering team may be responsible for designing the vehicle, right? So they have to design the vehicle. Their performance goal in that department to be designing minimum of 3 options for the artificially intelligent vehicle. That is their goal, very specific. It's about effectiveness. You've not talked about the efficiency. You've not talked about the cost of the design, but you just want it done by, again, now you have to align it. Don't forget, if the strategic objective of the organization is to produce that car by July 2026, then the design of the car probably needs to be done by October or latest by November 2025. Right now you're aligning it because you still have to review the design, you still have to pilot, you still have to test. So you in connecting goal for goal to ensure strategic accountability, you have to make sure that those measures are aligned in such a way that the performance measures that you'll be monitoring can actually help to deliver the organizational output or outcomes. Very, very important. So that's effectiveness for effectiveness. Let's come to efficiency. So if the efficiency is that, from the point of efficiency, remember you have already set a goal for the organization that whatever the resources used must be sustainable. Now, it may be more of your finance department, right? You may be working more with your finance department, or you may be working more with your for instance, maybe even work more with your marketing department. Maybe the goal would be to market the product ahead to ensure that you have investors that will put resources. Maybe you don't want to finance this by debt. Maybe you want to finance this more by investors' capital. So you want to also set that as a goal. Now, they will be aligning with the strategic objective. The strategic objective, in terms of, now remember we are talking about measures, right? The measures. You have looked at the effectiveness measure. Now we're looking at the efficiency measure. If the organization at the level, at that top level, has set a measure that they want to ensure that they are delivering this goal, this artificially intelligent vehicle, with sustainable resources, then at the level of division, the finance division, they also want to make sure that they are using funds that are more sustainable. For instance, capital, investors' capital, rather than debt, for instance. That's another example. And thirdly, let's talk about quality of service. Let's say that the organization has set a goal in terms of the quality of service that customers' complaints must be next to nil. Right, maybe maximum of 0.5% of customers must complain about the products, right? That is the goal they have set. Now, they now want to translate that. Maybe the production department, not necessarily the engineering department, maybe the production department may carry the bulk of that responsibility, and their own measure would also have to be aligned at 0.5%, and you may want to set a higher bar for them to say maximum of 0.2% or 0.25% of customers must complain about the design, because must complain about the production, beg your pardon, because the complaints may also still come from maybe from the design, maybe the complaints will still come from marketing, maybe the complaints will still come from sales, and they will also have a percentage of that 0.5%, but perhaps the bulk of the responsibility rests with the, for instance, with the production department, and they will carry the bulk of the weight of that measure. Now, this is just an example of how, remember, you can translate the monitoring. We must first define the measures, right? Again, remember, today we are looking at monitoring. How do we use performance monitoring to ensure strategic accountability, measuring the effectiveness and efficiency of products and services using performance management, specifically performance monitoring for strategic accountability? Now, once you have defined the measures, and this is where we wrap up, once you have defined the measures, anytime you are now monitoring, right, whether it is the board meeting with the CEO, or whether it is the CEO meeting with the C-suite officers, or the C-suite officers meeting with their own heads of different departments or units, and so on and so forth, or whether it is the unit head meeting with his or individual direct reports, right? whatever level it is, those measures that have been strategically defined. I took my time to take us step by step. Those measures that have been strategically defined, that have been strategically chosen, that certain things have to be discriminated against in order for you to streamline on those measures, are the ones that you monitor for. Then remember, you already have taken your time to identify using data, using evidence, using internal and external data to ensure that those measures are capable of delivering the strategic objectives, and there is that alignment. Once that alignment has been established at the level of planning, very, very, very important. When you get to the level of monitoring of the PIMA and of the timer and PIMA cycle, you can then confidently proceed to monitoring for those measures that have been defined both numerically and qualitatively. Very, very important. So again, we know that if you do not monitor, it's not likely to get done. Right? If you want to be strategically accountable as an organization to your stakeholders, to your clients, to your shareholders, to investors, if you want to be strategically accountable, then you must be monitoring, because monitoring enables, increases, facilitates implementation in a very significant manner. But you must be monitoring based on measures that have been strategically selected to align with the strategic goals, which should have been translated into the performance plans. Wow. I think this is where we're going to draw a curtain on this edition of the program. I really enjoyed doing this with us. There's still a lot to talk about this. I believe we are likely to still come back and continue on this note of monitoring the effectiveness and efficiency of products and services using performance management, and specifically performance monitoring to enhance strategic accountability. Thank you so much for doing this with us. We'll be back same time, same station next week, and we will continue the conversation. Until then, remember to be very strategic in your planning, but also strategic in your monitoring. That limited resource that you have in terms of time, in terms of resources, even in terms of tools, to conduct your performance monitoring sessions between the beginning of the performance plan and the performance evaluation must be directed to those measures that must have been strategically defined, and those ones that are most critical to the goals of the organization. That way, you will be monitoring in a manner that enables strategic accountability. I'll be back same time, same station next week by God's grace. Once then, my other colleagues will be here from Tuesday through Friday, coming with rich and robust content. And remember, you are the reason why we do this, so we look forward to hearing back from you. We want to get your feedback. What do you think about this? How can we help? Amogate is here to help you, to help your organizations with strategic plans, to help your performance with your performance management process, to also support you in connecting these even through technological tools like ASF, which is the Amogate Strategy Artificial Implementation Framework software. I'll be back same time, same station next week because until then, remain strategic, keep monitoring at the level of the organization, the department, and also the individual, and that way you increase the chances of implementation and remaining strategically accountable to your stakeholders as an organization. Thank you very much. I'll be back same time, same station next week, and until then, stay strategic and keep monitoring. Have a good day.